So Peshawar, Pakistan, another day. Now, unfortunately, another horrible terrorist attack. Now, this is significantly worse than others that we have seen. Now, we've seen some really terrible ones. So how are they going to outdo themselves? Well, the Taliban in this case hit a school filled with children. And it wasn't a minor hit. It was a major, massive, devastating hit. 141 people were killed. Of them, 132 were children. The students were 12 to 16 years old. This was the Army Public School and Degree College, but don't get confused. It is for kids. Taliban claimed that they were trying to avoid the really young kids. Wow, thank you so much. Didn't really do the job. If that's what your goal was, and of course it's not. So here is the Taliban representative. They said, we selected the Army school for the attack because the government is targeting our families and females. We want them to feel the pain. Well, on that note, yes, they do feel the pain. My guess is that soon you will also feel the pain, and round we go in these endless wars. In fact, the bombing of Taliban started nearly immediately in Pakistan thereafter. If you didn't want your neighborhoods being hit, this is a bizarre way of going about it, because I am positive that the entire country of Pakistan, let alone the rest of the world, is enraged by these actions, and there will be consequences. And unfortunately, this never has an end, and then they will come to strike back, and here we go again in circles. Okay, now, this is amazing. This comes from Jamaat ut Dawa. Their leader put out a message. Now, you might not know who those guys are. They're the ones who did the attack in Mumbai, in India. Killed about 166 people. I mean, it was a devastating terrorist attack. And even those guys say, whoa, the Taliban has gone too far here. Here's their statement. This was carried out by the enemies of Islam. It is open terrorism. These are barbarians operating under the name of jihad. So here is the leader of another terrorist group saying, wow, you guys have gone too far. You're giving jihad a bad name. Got news for you. It already had a pretty bad name. Okay? So this is amazing. We now live in a world where Al-Qaeda warns you about ISIS and say, those guys are crazy. They're much worse than us. Now you've got people that are much worse than the people who killed hundreds of people in India. Remember that story that was a couple of years back? They were shooting throughout the streets, and they couldn't find them, and it took so long, and they killed all those people. Now these guys are saying, get a load. What we did was nothing compared to these guys, right? So, and as this thing goes round and round, it picks up steam, and it gets worse and worse and worse. So Khorassani, who was the leader of the Taliban, who took credit, if you can imagine that, for this attack, said that the attackers had been ordered to shoot the older students, but not the young children. So, well, you shot 12 to 16-year-olds. Where did you draw the line? And it doesn't appear that they drew very many lines, because it appeared the shooting was very indiscriminate as they went classroom to classroom. So here are some witnesses. Mudassar Abbas says, I saw 6 or 7 people walking class to class and opening fire on children. That doesn't appear that they were asking the kids' age, right? They were shooting in the mall. Here's another student who said, while we were being moved out, we saw bodies of our classmates lying in the corridors. Can you imagine? Now, here's a kid who was shot in both legs. He's hiding under his desk, but he doesn't want to make a sound because he's afraid that if he screams out in pain as he's been shot, that they'll know he's still alive and kill him. So he says, I folded my tie and pushed it into my mouth so that I wouldn't scream. Well, this is exactly what terror looks like. It is unbelievably terrifying. And, you know, you got the people who survived, and there are dozens and dozens who are injured, of course. You've got the grieving families. You've got the kids who were killed. You've got the teachers who were killed. And understand this, to the best of our knowledge, the victims were also all Muslim. So this was done in some perverse interpretation of Islam. although as an agnostic, I don't believe there is a great interpretation of Islam. There are good parts of the Quran talking about, how everyone is equal in the eyes of Allah. Yes, there are good parts. And then there are parts, just like in the Bible, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, that can be interpreted to carry out this kind of evil. And unfortunately, fundamentalism throughout the world has gotten worse and worse, and we have arrived at this point. The final quote that I want to give you is from Tahir Ali. He is a father of a 14-year-old who was killed. And as he was recovering his son's body from the hospital, he said, "My son was my dream. My dream has been killed." What do we do in a world full of fundamentalists who resort to violence, who don't listen to reason, who actively fight against logic and reason? You can't have a conversation with them. You can't reason with them. You can't talk sense into them. They don't care about sense. They actively oppose sense. You hit them, they hit you back. You bomb from the sky, they say, "Oh, you killed my civilians." And sometimes that is true. Okay? Or you killed my leaders. So that is oftentimes also true. They say, "Okay, now I'm going to respond by killing your children." Then we go and we bomb them more. So violence hasn't gotten us to the answer. We've been doing this war on terror for over 13 years now. And where has it brought us? Where has it brought Pakistan? Where has it brought all of these countries? On the other hand, as I see this, every human instinct in my body, and I'm sure for a lot of you, is to strike back. I mean, as I read that father's quote about his son, the anger that rises up in all of us is undeniable. There are no easy answers here. I do know one of the problems, and that is the religion itself that says, do not listen to reason, get rid of logic, and sense be damned. Only rely on an ancient text that was oftentimes written by power-hungry men for their own purposes thousands of years ago. Rely on that, take the most vicious parts, and then perpetrate that violence throughout the world. And we're supposed to just sit here and respect that. Well, I don't respect it at all, at all. Your religion, and it's not just Muslims, it's also Christians, it's also Hindus who strike out against Muslims, and lately in Myanmar, Buddhists who strike out against Muslims. It happens to all the different groups, they are victims, and Muslims often do it against other Muslims, as happened in this case. But all of your religions, with all of their nonsense texts and dogma, they are wrong. God did not speak to a bush. There was no such person as Moses. There's hardly any historical record of a guy named Jesus, let alone what he said, which was documented decades and decades later, and then agreed upon which text they would keep and lose hundreds of years later after this supposed Jesus of Nazareth lived. And then the history of Muhammad is, yes, historical. It's also historical that he wanted land and power and women, and he used this text to get it. That I understand. You can call it terrible, but we've had empires throughout the history of the world. What I can't understand is 1,400 years later, in the case of the New Testament, 2,000 years, Old Testament, more than 2,500 years later, we would be listening to people who had no earthly idea how things worked. They thought the stars were little holes that God had pricked into heaven so you could see the light of heaven. They didn't know anything. They were almost literally cavemen. They made up these stories so that they would have something to believe and something to make sense of the world, because they didn't have science then, they didn't have facts, they didn't have the knowledge that we have today. And we have those things. We know they're not pinholes in the sky that brings us the light of heaven. We know that they are stars and galaxies and universe. We know these things, yet people still cling on to this madness, which leads to this result. It doesn't always lead to it. Not every religious person is a bad person. Of course, my hero is Martin Luther King Jr. He was a reverend, talked about Jesus all the time. I understand that. But religious people, you know, you certainly have a responsibility too. Read your books, read the Bible, read the Quran. And don't skip over the atrocious and vicious and honestly genocidal part of the books. And they're in all of them. And don't point fingers at the other religions, pretending the one that you happen to be born into is just the perfect one. You got so lucky. Isn't that funny how everybody got lucky that the religion they're born into is the right one, and everybody else got unlucky when they were born into a different religion? Do you not have any sense of reason? How could that possibly be true? But yet you all cling on to it, and you all make excuses, and you rationale, and if we dare to tell you what is obviously true, you get so offended. Well, this is what I'm offended by. When 141 people die and 132 kids die in that school because somebody believed that their sky god told them to go kill kids. That's what I'm offended by. And that's what religion has brought us. End it. End it. Let's be done with these old, horrible, violent myths that have done us so much damage. Young Turks. All right, back on the Young Turks. Let me read a couple of your tweets because I think they're relevant in a day like today. First, Jeremy Varner says, as I kept hearing throughout the day, the smallest coffins are the heaviest. On the other hand, Nexus Hexus says that TYT is provocateur politics. They want to make sure the government responds with a sizable response that prove oppression. If you think we have some sort of agenda that we want more bombings or something, and that's why we're talking about this story, how do you want? That's first insane. Second of all, how do you want me to talk about this story? Should I downplay it? I mean, I don't. How would you talk about the story? What's your response? So I'm puzzled by that. I hope I misunderstood it because it makes no sense to me whatsoever. And Vancher says, agree in theory, Cenk, about what I said about religion, but is this attack about religion or more about despair? Well, the answer is both. And so that's what drives me crazy about both sides, whether it is the people defending religion saying it's never about religion. Well, that doesn't make any sense. They said it was about religion, and they use religion to justify it. Now, that doesn't mean that religion is the sole problem on earth, and that's the only reason that these guys even did it. Yes, we live in a gray world. We live in a nuanced world. It could be several different factors. Are they also, in despair because they have no power and they feel that their government is picking on them, the Western governments are picking on them? There are elements of that, of course. And to look at religion without the socio-political context, well, that drives me crazy as well. And I think I've shown that in a 3-hour interview I did with Sam Harris, let alone God knows how many times I've said it on the show, right? But the answer is not black and white. It's not either religion or not religion. But if you think the religion didn't have anything to do with those attacks today, I mean, I think that you're kidding yourself. Of course it did. Of course it did. So, all right. So, look, some days I miss radio, man. Like okay, anyway. Let's go on. I got a lot of stories to get to, guys. And so let me give you more.